So there we go. I think we're started now. Thank you everybody for joining us. My name is Jimena and I'm here with Sabine and Jessica as well, who wasn't able to join us today. We coordinate the Tropical Restoration Network, which is a network that focuses on restoration of mangroves and seagrasses in the tropical region of Central America and the Gulf. And so we, as part of the Tropical Restoration Network, we do different activities. Sometimes we do conferences. We've done training courses, and we also do these webinars, and then we record them and we post them online on our YouTube channel. There's a lot of past seminars that you can access through the YouTube channel, but then we also have the website and the socials so that you can access different types of material and different activities that are going on. So please be sure to join us, whether it's on socials, or I'll be sure to add you the link to join our mailing list as well. So we send out some information in a newsletter that way as well. But today in particular, we welcome Dr. Megan Saunders. So Megan did her bachelor's in marine biology from Simon Fraser University in Canada, so she's Canadian. She did a PhD in oceanography from Dalhousie University, also in Canada, and then did several postdocs all the way over in Australia at the University of Western Australia and the University of Queensland. Her current role is actually leading an interdisciplinary research program on scaling up marine and coastal restoration as a senior research scientist at the Commonwealth Scientific Industrial Research Organization, which is CSIRO, in Hobart, Tasmania, which is Australia's national science agency. And Megan is also actually one of the co-leads on the Australian Coastal Restoration Network, the ACRN, which connects to over 600 members in the restoration profession across several countries in the area. And so we've had the pleasure of connecting our Tropical Restoration Network with the Australian one as well. And we'd really just like to thank Megan for her time in sharing this talk with you today. So I'll leave it with you. Thank you, Megan.
Thank you, Jimena. Thanks for the introduction and nice to see you all on the call. Thank you for joining us. We're having a few technical issues with actually getting presenter mode sharing, so just bear with me with the slides showing up in non-presenter mode, but hopefully you get the idea. So my presentation today is Derisking Landscape Scale Coastal and Marine Ecological Restoration. I grew up on the west coast of Canada. I spent time on the traditional lands of the Tsleil-Waututh First Nation and the Comox First Nation in both Vancouver and the Gulf Islands of British Columbia. These are really beautiful places. Here's the rocky shoreline near where I spent a lot of time. In that area, there were amazing kelp forests, like the one you see here of giant kelp macrocystis. And I really was fascinated by these places, these like really dark, gloomy, mysterious, moving environments with lots of fish and other animals, and it really captured my attention. And I really say I took it for granted that those places would always be there. Until one day, we returned for the summer, and the kelp was looking very thin. And seemingly in front of our eyes, those kelp forests disappeared. And what had happened was they had been slowly eaten away by these red sea urchins, Strongylocentrotus turbaciensis, the urchin front, which had expanded and moved and fairly quickly mowed that kelp forest down. This was about 30 years ago. And the kelp hasn't come back yet. The loss of that kelp, I felt really profoundly. And so did a lot of other people in the area. And I was left with a feeling of, like, how could this have happened? And why aren't we doing anything about it? So I think that really set off my career trajectory towards where I am now, and really thinking about how we do marine and coastal ecological restoration in different ecosystems and how we scale it up. So I live now in beautiful city of Hobart, Tasmania. This is the very far south end of Australia. So it's a temperate environment, not the tropics like you might imagine of Australia. But here is where I lead my research program from. And what I want to ultimately achieve in this research program is moving towards coordinated landscape scale coastal and marine ecological restoration that delivers ecosystem services to people, helps support biodiversity, and helps us mitigate and adapt to climate change. So in today's presentation, I'll run through some definitions, some background material many of you will be familiar with, but I'll go through it fairly quickly, including some definitions and the types of actions we're talking about and the scale over which we're thinking. I'll then give you some information on the interdisciplinary research program that I lead, and also about the Australasian Coastal Restoration Network, which I co-lead. And I have to say, I'm really excited to hopefully interact with some of you, and I think it would be really great if we could increase the connections across our two networks. So when I'm talking about ecological restoration, I use a fairly flexible interpretation of that. So of course, the Society for Ecological Restoration describes restoration as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. This is really thinking about the concept of returning an ecosystem back to a baseline or reference state with some sort of continuum of interventions from reducing impacts all the way to fully recovered. But I also like to include concepts of nature-based solutions in my research program. So these are actions to address societal challenges through the protection, sustainable management, and restoration of ecosystems. So restoration, of course, is an option within NBS, but NBS can employ other techniques which aren't trying to get back to a historical or reference condition. Now, the reason why I think it's important in the modern day to use both of these terms and to sort of think of them together is that as we move through the Anthropocene and with increasing effects of climate change, it will become less and less likely to be able to achieve reference or baseline states. So that's why I include both of those concepts here. And when I say restoration, it can be a little bit flexible across those. So in my research program, I think about restoration across a number of the dominant coastal marine ecosystems in Australia, which includes mangroves and salt marshes, seagrass meadows and shellfish reefs, and kelp or macroalgae and coral reefs. These are the dominant ecosystems around Australia. Also including within the concept of restoration, that kind of passive mitigation, maybe fencing or reducing stressors, also rebuilding hydrology or physical structures, or the addition of biological material like so transplanting or seeding. Now, I have a lot of enthusiasm for coastal and marine restoration, as I'm sure many of you do too. But the reality is that when we look through the global literature, projects to date have typically been small scale, less than a hectare. They've been expensive, median cost of $400,000 per hectare, and prone to failure, or at least with fairly variable rates of success. So together, this had maybe up until, I'd say maybe 5 or 10 years ago, had led restoration to not really be a primary intervention in many coastal and marine environments. However, I've observed quite a substantial shift over the past particularly 5 years, where the recognition that implementing protected areas and managing other stressors really isn't recovering ecosystems in the way that we'd like. So restoration, of course, now being a more prominent intervention being considered around the world. Now, despite that enthusiasm, we know there's lots of barriers to restoration that span economic, political, social, environmental, and technical realms. And we need to overcome those barriers, but also to increase our coordination from across local, regional, state, or provincial and national scales to be able to really achieve restoration at large scales. And why we're interested in large scales, of course, ecological restoration is now very firmly on the international agenda. The Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, Target 2, to restore 30% of degraded ecosystems by 2030, really put the onus on countries to make their own commitments to achieving that target. So countries are achieving, or are, I guess, making their promises or commitments towards the convention through their National Biodiversity Strategy Action Plans, or NBSAPs. And here I've shown the two for the countries that I have nationality for. So Canada's 2030 Nature Strategy an Australia strategy for nature. So for anyone on the call, I encourage you, if you haven't already, to have a look at what your country has done for an NBSAP, if it has one, for the most recent COP. Now, Justine Bell-James and James Watson at the University of Queensland recently published this piece where they took the NBSAPs that had been published in time for the last year's COP, and they looked at them and kind of dissected the NBSAPs, and they looked at things like, was there a lot of specific kind of information in them? Was there a plan? Are there numbers around the target that those countries are trying to achieve? And from the 32 NBSAPs that were available at that time, they kind of divided them roughly into two categories. So one is countries that have a really big ambition. They might say, we're trying to meet the 30 by 30 restoration target, or maybe even more than that in some cases. But they don't have a really strong plan for how to get there. And then the other group of countries has a pretty good plan, like some very specific kind of detail around certain programs and ecosystems they're planning to work in, for example, but not a lot of ambition. So maybe even no percentage that they're trying to achieve. So Professors Bell-James and Watson really thought that we needed to move forward and close both of those gaps. So I think that's a useful framing for the research I'll present to you today, which has an overall goal of closing gaps in both implementation and ambition for coastal and marine ecological restoration to achieve social ecological outcomes at large scales. So I'll like to tell you a bit about a research program I've been co-leading over the past several years that's been funded by Australia's National Environmental Science Program, the Marine and Coastal Hub. So this is a program that is funding from the Commonwealth Government, which is then matched by research partner organisations. And so in this, the NES Marine and Coastal Hub has been really supportive of a program of work around restoration, which includes a number of different projects and people. These are the three that I've been leading or co-leading. The first was a roadmap to restoration. The second was around identifying and overcoming barriers. And the third is around derisking. So I'll tell you a little bit more about those three in a bit more detail. Before I go on, I want to acknowledge that this is a huge team effort. Nathan Waltham from JCU, James Cook University, and Rebecca Morris from the University of Melbourne are the co-leads on the work, and involves a lot of people from a lot of different organisations around Australia. So really, really grateful to the team for pulling together this research. So in the first project, a roadmap to landscape scale coastal and marine ecological restoration, we had a number of activities. We did a national survey, so this was social science, to understand the current state of restoration in Australia. We did a targeted piece around Indigenous engagement to understand the unique perspectives of those communities. We did a number of workshops with project team and end users. We pulled together a number of case studies of successful restoration nationally. We reviewed the coastal engineering literature to understand how engineers actually predict coastal hazard protection from nature-based solutions. And we pulled the findings, we distilled the findings from these into what we called the roadmap to restoration. Now, there's not a lot of data in this presentation, but there's a few graphs so that you know there are some numbers actually behind some of this work. Here is the breakdown of some of the participants in the engagement we did, from research, state government, community, federal government, local government, natural resource management authorities, and the private sector. So we had a pretty good representation across different types of organization that are involved in restoration. When we asked people what to rank their main barriers to restoration, probably no surprise to many of you, the top barriers to restoration were related to funding and to legislation, specifically permitting, which I'll speak to a bit more later on. So these findings are actually really, I think, important in the roadmap, because it really elevated these kind of social, legal, societal elements that are barriers to restoration, more so than science at that point in time. So here's, after quite a bit of work, here's what we came up with for the roadmap to restoration. Now I'm conscious this is quite small, so you won't be able to read those details. I'll zoom in on a few of them down the track. But what we came up with was 10 guiding principles to coordinated landscape scale, coastal and marine restoration. Starting at the bottom left, co-design is central, fit for purpose governance, and no-cap funding, and then flowing through to some others. So we really thought that we needed to elevate and highlight the factors that a large program of restoration would need to keep in mind. So the second project, we then dug into 3 of those barriers. So the fit for purpose governance, which is around legal and governance barriers. The second one in the middle is nature-based solutions are implemented. These are like barriers that the engineering sector experience when they're trying to implement a nature-based solution. So for example, an engineer, a coastal engineer, will need to certify that any work that they do is able to withstand a certain return interval event, for example, or a category 3 cyclone, etc. And because methods to do that using nature-based approaches aren't really available, that's a major barrier to the engineering sector. And then the third on the right, this is a piece that I led with Mibu Fisher, who's a Quandamooka woman in Australia and works at CSIRO. It's called Barriers to Indigenous Participation. So this roadmap principle is co-design is central. It's really elevating, articulating the fact that restoration is a complex activity. It needs input from many different actors. And we really wanted to understand better what the barriers were to Indigenous communities in Australia in participating or leading restoration. I'll tell you a little bit more about that one here. The approach we took was interviews and collaboration with 3 traditional owners from 2 different groups. So on the left, you'll see Jacob Cassidy in the top left photo there with Maria Vosso from CSIRO on the left and Nathan Waltham from James Cook University on the right. Jacob is the manager of Mongala Station. So this is in Ingham in North Queensland, Australia. Pictured heavy rainfall, really hot tropical floodplains. And in that area, Jacob and Nathan have been with others working on tidal reintroduction to wetlands, so mangroves and marshes. So these are areas where there have been barriers to the tides put in to create kind of more terrestrial freshwater environments. And one of the actions we can do to restore them is to take out those barriers and let the seawater come back and let mangroves reestablish and tidal wetlands reestablish. The second group that we worked with were Bryce Liddell and Robert Cooley from the Gamay Rangers. Gamay is also called Botany Bay. It's in Sydney, one of the largest cities in Australia, about 5 million people. So it's a very different environment, slightly more temperate or subtropical, and lots of people around, kind of urbanized embayment. So very different kind of social, ecological context. And the Gamay Rangers have been doing some really exciting work on mostly seagrass, also some shellfish restoration. So we worked with these guys to understand what they've been doing, where the opportunities were, what the barriers had been, and what advice they might have for others interested in working in this space. So once again, this is quite small. I'll give you a little walkthrough. What we did is, using social science methods, kind of interpret the dominant information in those interviews to identify what some of the enabling conditions had been for those groups to be successful in restoration, as well as coming up with some specific advice for Indigenous groups looking to partner with Western scientific groups, for funders and decision makers looking to enhance the Indigenous representation in their programs, and for Western scientists who are looking to increase their capacity to partner with Indigenous groups. So if you are interested in more, if you want to look at that in more detail, you can take a shot of the QR codes there, which you can look at the image in more detail, or you could also, I'm pretty excited about it. We've actually animated that image into a short 3-minute video. Okay, so the third project in the Nest Marine and Coastal Hub was this third project, De-risking nature repair in Australian coastal and marine ecosystems. So building off the success and momentum of those previous two projects, we had a goal. This was informed through our conversations with some of the Commonwealth and some of the state government agencies, was that they really said they were interested in us to provide some up-to-date, synthesized information to support the evidence base about ecological restoration activities, outcomes, and risks to inform decision-making. So I'll dig into those in a little bit more detail as we progress here. So the first aim of this project, and it's underway at the minute. If I speak to you again in a couple of years, I can provide some more information on the outcomes. But the first aim is to update the stocktake of projects nationally. So this is really about being able to say, this is what has been done and where it has been achieved. So on the left, you'll see this is the Australasian Coastal Restoration Network database. So this database was last updated in 2018. And of course, there's been a lot happening since then. So we are in progress of updating that. We've already identified a number of projects to include. On the right, you'll see the Living Shorelines Australia database. This is a database of nature-based solutions for coastal hazard protection, led by Rebecca Morris and Steve Swearer and Andrew Pomeroy at the University of Melbourne, University of Western Australia. So really interesting, actually. There's almost no overlap across the projects between those two databases. So what that really suggests is that, although I did say I use those two terms fairly interchangeably or somewhat interchangeably, there's a very big distinction in the way projects are being implemented, the way we interpret them, the communities doing those work. It also shows how the motivation to be conducting the action has a big kind of effect on how we're thinking about these projects. So on the left, these are projects that are really around ecological outcomes to recover habitat, whereas on the right, these are projects that are about that primary objective of coastal hazard protection. So the aim 2 of this project is around de-risking. And I've been told that this is kind of a slang sort of term. So what do I mean? Well, when I think about de-risking, I think about when we are implementing marine restoration at fairly small, fairly experimental scales, there's not a lot of risk of taking the action. I mean, sure, you might waste your time, you might waste your money, the project might not be successful, and maybe there's some kind of issues along the way, but the overall issues will typically be quite small. However, as we scale up to larger seascape, landscape scales for restoration, and certainly when we're thinking about trying to meet these really lofty international targets, we need to start thinking a lot more carefully about the risks of taking or not the interventions. So what this work package will do is focus on characterizing the outcomes of restoration activities, so both the ecological, engineering, and socioeconomic outcomes, but also, and I think this is a fairly novel part of the project, is also looking at what the risks are of taking those actions. So we'll be looking at that through the legal and governance lens, through the environmental lens, through a lens of Indigenous co-design, and through a lens of kind of more overall kind of synopsis of the risks of those activities. The third aim of this project is what we're calling the forward framework, a forward-looking framework. And in this, we're acknowledging that, like many people around the world, really trying to grapple with how we do this well, how we do it at scale. But we also need to start paying attention to lay the architecture for what large programs might look like or need to look like in the future. So this is being led by Nathan Waltham and Katie Motson at James Cook University. And the starting point for them is really looking around the world for large programs of restoration and seeing what their characteristics are and how they're working. So stay tuned for more on that. Now, I think this has been an exciting research program for me. I've told you about these 3 projects in the program, but now I'd like to tell you a little bit about how it has guided some strategic research in other projects. So the first one, the roadmap principle, restoration is coordinated and at scale. Here's an example of research led by Maria Vosso at CSIRO that is aimed around guiding seascape scale multi-habitat restoration. We in Australia commonly have been thinking about restoration single habitats at a time, but the work that Maria is putting forward is really calling for a more holistic approach where we specifically acknowledge that coastal ecosystems exist in seascapes that are connected by biological, physical, and chemical processes. For example, in this beautiful image from Fiji, we have the waves on the right, which are protected by the coral reef so that there's a calm lagoon for seagrass, and then mangroves or coastal forests inshore, which in turn are trapping sediments and therefore protecting or providing habitat for the underwater systems to the right. So we really think that moving forward, if we want to achieve these large scales of restoration, that harnessing these connections across habitats will be essential and will help us to achieve better outcomes. So the second example I'd like to share, this is the roadmap principle no gap funding. So for this, I'm collaborating with a project called an Ecological knowledge system to support nature repair in Australia. Anna Buchnow from CSIRO is co-leading an activity with me where we are basically providing some recommendations on how marine and coastal ecosystems can be incorporated into Australia's nature repair market. I might just back up for a second there. Carbon markets, of course, are very familiar to most people, but biodiversity markets are emerging in a number of places. And Australia very recently launched the nature repair market, which is a biodiversity market that creates certificates for biodiversity for eligible proponents using eligible methods. And then those certificates can be traded or sold. So it's really aimed at incentivizing private sector investment into ecological restoration. The last that I'd like to share with you here is around fit for purpose governance. I mentioned this before. In Australia, this is a huge issue. And so this is in collaboration with Professor Justine Bell-James at the University of Queensland, a research program that she's leading that's really around interpreting and informing policy related to restoration. So that top center paper that you see looks around the world for examples of where there's good legal and governance solutions for permitting issues in marine and coastal restoration. And on the right, she led a team that interpreted the Global Biodiversity Framework's ecosystem restoration target, all the specific wording through a legal perspective. So I'm happy to share more about that if you have questions later. So that kind of wraps up what I wanted to share about the research program. And bring it back to the introduction where I talked about these gaps, where we have an implementation gap, and that really what we need to do to overcome the implementation gap is to get better at doing ecological restoration. So it's improving techniques, improving our understanding of the systems, and improving our ability to actually implement it, which involves getting through those issues around funding, around social issues, social license and governance, etc. But I'll just take a moment actually to speak about that ambition gap that the others had articulated. So what this really means is that, are we actually trying to achieve enough? And so one of the ways I think was putting my mind to how we can overcome that, and some of the ways that I'm doing it is through partnerships, so partnering with government agencies, partnering with other organizations to really build up some momentum. I also take on advisory roles. I'm working on policy papers. For example, I'm co-leading the National Marine Science Committee white paper on ecosystem restoration and repair, which is underway at the moment. I'll just mention advocacy for a moment. This is definitely not a role that I take as a government scientist, but it's certainly open to others, where we might be asking for more ambitious targets. And then lastly, the one I want to speak about a little bit more is around building networks. So as Jimena mentioned earlier, I am co-lead of the Australasian Coastal Restoration Network with Nathan Waltham. This network was started in around 2017 or so, where the first symposium was held in Townsville, Australia. Since then, Nathan and I have taken on stewardship of the network. We have over 600 members. It's free to join. If you'd like to check out our website or our social media, please do, and we'd love to interact with you. Drop us an email on the email address there. The ACRN is supported by the Nest Marine and Coastal Hub, as well as with funding from New South Wales Government, and then supported by CSIRO and JCU through mine and Nathan's participation in it. So we host an annual symposium. This year's will be in Canberra in September. So if you happen to have some free time and money and want to join us, we'd love to have you there. It's the network has been really fantastic for bringing people together, for knowledge sharing, and really helping, I think, to achieve the ambition in restoration as well. So I think of it this way, where we have restoration is a complex activity. We have lots of people doing it. A place like Australia is really big, as is Latin America and the Caribbean. We have lots of people working on different things, and that's excellent. But what about if we connect those people together? Doing that can help increase the opportunities for collaboration. It can help increase the connection, knowledge sharing, and really generating a shared understanding around the challenges and opportunities that we're all experiencing. And I think collectively what that does is create a whole that is much greater than the sum of its parts. I think as a network, we start having a larger voice, we start having possibly more influence, and are really actually better positioned to be able to help the people that might be looking for help around restoring the ecosystems in our areas. So I'm looking forward to speaking with some of you more about your network. So that brings me to the end. I'd really like to thank the Australian Government, National Environmental Science Programme, Marine and Coastal Hub for funding our research, as well as all the people, the collaborators and participants that have been involved in this work. I'd also like to acknowledge CSIRO through a Julius Career Award for supporting my time currently in Canada, and soon I'll be visiting Costa Rica as well. So that's all from me. Thank you very much for your time. Please do check out the ACRN or the CSIRO Marine Restoration and Nature-Based Solutions webpage. Drop me a line, and I'd love to connect with you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Megan. That was such an interesting talk and so many topics and all the different work that you're doing. It's great to see everything that you've been up to. I'd like to open it up to anybody that has any questions at this time, English or Spanish. Megan understands a lot of Spanish, a lot more than she'd say. And then if not, I'm happy to help. Si tienen alguna pregunta que quieran hacerle a Megan. You can just open your mic, no problem. Pueden abrir el micrófono. O lo ponen en el chat.
If there's no questions, I would love to hear, and I'm not sure if you want to keep recording or stop recording. If we want to have a conversation, I'd love to hear more about your network, and if any of the things that I spoke on today resonated both as similarly or as very, very different in your particular context.
Certainly.
Hola,
Natalia, you have a question? Yeah.
Yes. I was wondering, like working as a network, what were the main challenges that you faced? Is it easier like to get everybody working together in those kind of topics? Or like what are your main learnings or challenges?
Yeah, great. Thank you for your question. So I think with the network, obviously, well, I guess for me, when I took on the sort of steerage of the network, I didn't have any experience leading a network, so I had to kind of work out what what that involved and what it looked like, and yeah, really what my role is, what I could bring to it. So I'll give you an example of some of the activities that we've done to help support that. We have a website, we have social media, we have a secretariat. This was really, really important. Someone who is paid 1 day a week to actually support the activities of the network. So I think funding is obviously a challenge. When we didn't have funding, Nathan and I were leading the network, and we're pretty time limited, as many people are. So yeah, just really getting some funding and getting someone really good to be in that role was really important for what I would say the successes. We have also formed a steering committee that includes half a dozen or so representatives from different types of organizations and geographies and habitats across Australia. So we meet quarterly, and that gives a bit of governance over the network and makes it a bit more not just the three of us doing it, but more voices involved. And then I think the third thing, probably one of the things that is very successful for the network, is we've had this annual symposium for the past 3 years. And every year I think, am I really going to do this again? Because it's obviously a fair bit of work pulling together a symposium for 100 people. But I love it. And the community seems to really love it. I've had a number of people say like how much they enjoy attending and how important it is in their kind of calendar now. So we want to keep going with that. So I think kind of to summarize that, having that as an activity that the community can really participate in has been important. I would say one more thing probably about that. Last year in our workshop in Sydney, we kind of tried an idea of having a mini workshop as part of the symposium. So instead of just having talk, we inserted a little workshop as a way of promoting people to talk together. But I actually connected that to the Nature Repair Market project. And then invited my government collaborators on that project to attend the symposium. And I think that was a really effective way of bringing people together around kind of a shared objective. And we're hoping to actually hear a little quite soon about how the outcomes of that have actually helped to inform policy moving forward. So yeah, those are a few kind of rambling thoughts about it. I have probably talked less about the barriers, but if you have specific questions, I'd be happy to talk more about it.
And for those of you that are based in Costa Rica, yes, like Megan mentioned, she'll be arriving here and we'll be in San Jose for the next week, and we'll be having different types of activities, and she'll be giving more talks. So I'll make sure to push that along socials as well, so that you can participate in what you want. Is there any other questions? ¿Alguna otra pregunta? I actually wanted to ask Megan, because our tropical restoration network is a mixture of different types of sort of practitioners and government people that work in government, academics, students, and it's very heterogeneous. I don't know how to say that, heterogeneous
right.
in that way. And we find that really strengthens the type of activities and things that we do. How is your network sort of, I know that it's up to 600 members, but how are they mostly in academia? Are they mostly students, or is it a mixture sort of like ours as well?
Yeah, ours is like yours as well. And I'd agree that's definitely one of the keys to success of it. And that the symposium is an opportunity for people from different sectors to come together that is different to a scientific conference, which would be generally more academics. So I think people really appreciate that opportunity. And it's something that we really try to foster with the network, is making the symposium cost neutral, so it's as inexpensive as possible as we can make for people to join it, because not everyone has research budgets, for instance. And we really try and foster a sense of belonging, of community, of everyone's welcome, and really to try and make it a really positive and fun environment for people. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. If anybody has any other burning questions, if not, we might stop the recording right here, and then we can continue later.